Amid an empire drained of color, painter Mei Lin discovers a forbidden southern pigment that can revive memory. As her art restores the emperor's fading mind, it ignites political unrest, turning her quiet craft into an act of rebellion against a world that has forgotten how to see.
The palace looked as if it had been rinsed in ash. Banners that once proclaimed seasons and victories now hung like tired tongues. Lacquered tables, once mirror-bright under oil and sun, gave back only a dull suggestion of their previous richness. Even faces, the small planes that had once answered to blush and shadow, seemed to have been carefully bleached by an imperial hand, until everyone looked as if painted in a single careful wash. Mei Lin moved through these rooms as if wearing a second, private skin of memory, one that catalogued what each color had been, even when the world had forgotten how to hold it. Her studio was a pocket of stubborn habit at the edge of the inner courts, half utility room, half shrine. It had no window that opened to the garden. The one narrow aperture faced the palace eaves and the lean line of sky beyond. In early light the room read like a black and white engraving, stacks of rolled paper, the clean curve of porcelain mortars, a low table peppered with small dishes of ash, rice and iron filings. On one wall, a shallow shelf held a row of jars, ash-glazed tea storage, and iron-stained clay pots, each labeled in Mei Lin's tidy hand: cinnabar paste, indigo rinse, orpiment dust, a smudge that she had once called summer peach, though it had long since become a memory. She worked with the rituals of someone who believed ceremony could keep things safe. When she ground a pigment bone white, say, or the small, stubborn red from the heart of a mineral, she faced the mixture like a worshipper. Her hands, small and stained to the knuckles, moved with the same patience that had been taught to her by her grandmother along the coast, where they used tides instead of clocks and songs instead of receipts. She would dissolve the mineral, test the grind with the crook of her thumb, blot a line on paper, and wait for the paper to disclose the truth. The ritual was physical and mnemonic, the sound of stone on stone, the smell of wet earth and boiled rice. The way her tongue remembered the textural difference between a true lake blue and a pallid imitation. Mei Lin's private journal lay open beneath a paperweight shaped like a small moon. It was a book that smelled of oil and salt, its pages filled with notes in a hand that never allowed for flourish, pigment recipes, names of miners, the weather on the days she had made particular preparations. But mostly it was a ledger of recollections, little entries like brush strokes that held a world together. She had written, after a long night, crushed lapis with rice water, less grit, more sheen. Recall consort's cuff, 12th moon, when emperor laughed. The journal was a living map of loss. When colors vanished around her, she recorded them as if by writing their names she could tether them back into being. The court moved through the same set of rituals with a far colder hand. Each rehearsal of ceremony now seemed to be performed to keep the shape of the state, rather than the warmth of the people who animated it. The emperor's public forms remained robes layered in the latticework of ritual ranks, incense clouds to carry prayers, but between motions there were pauses that crackled with unease. Names were sometimes missed. A line of an ancient poem would come to his lips, and then dissolve like old lacquer when the next command was required. Those who watched him close said he had lost more than memory. He had lost a certainty of place in his own story. Eunuch Rong came to Mei Lin one late morning as she was grading old vermilion. He appeared without the shallow flourish of attendants. The eunuchs who served the inner rooms knew better than to carry anything loud into a painter's space. Rong's grey robes matched the palace mood, and his face wore the careful neutrality that had kept men like him living in the spaces between favors and accusations. He had a way of moving that made him look like a small creek navigating between rocks, soft, patient, moving where pressure allowed. "Painter," he said, and his voice was the smallest of whispers, "a word if you have breath to spare." Mei Lin wiped her hands on a rag and inclined her head. "For you, always." He lingered at the threshold, His fingers closed around the hem of his robe, a gesture of habit rather than need. The emperor was in the court this morning. He asked for a favorite song, an old children's rhyme, I think. He could not remember the lines. He stopped and looked at a painted screen that still had its blue, do you know, the sort that used to be at the southern courts. He named a child's name, then asked who that person had been. He does not know his own minister's family names as he once did. There was a hush. Each word settled into the room like a thin shell of frost. Mei Lin thought of the emperor's hand, the way it would have cupped a painted chrysanthemum as a boy. She thought of the sudden, keen of loneliness that must follow the inability to call one's own name. She had seen the parlor of the state's exterior and assumed it was a matter of ceremony and extractive economies. To hear that the man at its center was unmoored, this was a different, more intimate kind of erosion. They worry, Rong said. The Grand Secretary speaks of austerity. He says we must make less, keep less, so that less can go wrong. Mei Lin kept her face blank. Austerity was shortened for control. Control was shorthand for a slow strangling of the things that made the court alive. Yet she had not expected the matter to reach her so directly. Pain, she knew, could be kept out of sight for a time, but paint wanted light. The pigment in the jars wanted faces to touch. Rong hesitated, then produced from the folds of his robe a small parcel wrapped in common paper. "A gift for you," he said. "From the corridors near the eastern storeroom. A poor thing, but it may be of use." Mei Lin felt something like hunger and caution meet in the center of her chest. The paper crackled. Inside was a scrap of silk no larger than a hand, woven in a pattern she did not expect in this climate, a slightly oblique wave design. The sort of weave she had seen once in her grandmother's box of keepsakes. Its color had been diluted by age and by the shifting world, but there were threads of a blue that still pulsed faintly beneath the dust. At the selvage, minuscule stitches had been made to secure a narrow strip of paper, the fibers already yellowed. When Mei Lin drew it free, she recognized the looped handwriting as being not of the capital. The characters listed minerals, and next to one a note in shorthand, ferment with rice, sea washed. Binder lacquer brine. For sky on robes. Her throat tightened. The word southern hovered unspoken in her mind, the southern kingdom whose workshops had been shattered in a purge 10 years past, its artisans driven north or worse, their pigments burned or outlawed. The court had taught future generations to call those lands traitors and to strip their craft from the charts of official culture. Pigments had become evidence of subversion. Mei Lin had heard the tales as a child, heard mothers hush children with stories of colors stolen under moonlight. Her grandmother's songs had been the only map of those colors that remained. The blue on the scrap was wrong in a way that made her breath quicken. It was not Lake Indigo as she knew it, nor the paler, manufactured blues common in the north. This blue held a depth that looked possible only in the sea salt and depth, and a sky at the hinge of morning. It sat like a memory in the weave. Mei Lin brought her thumb to it and did not plan to do so, perhaps because she had been taught to be careful with pigments, to taste them only in the lines of poems and never with flesh. But the touch registered. The blue left a minuscule stain on her skin like the first signature of rain. A small sound from the corridor startled her, the measured tread of a servant, a muted cough, and she folded the scrap as if it were a small wounded bird. Rong watched her with an expression that was almost solicitous. "Do not speak of this now, painter. The Grand Secretary would tear this as leverage. Keep it if you can, or burn it if you must. There are more who would see it as cause for trouble than for beauty." The two sat for a moment in mutual weighing. Mei Lin thought of the emperor's face as Rong had described it, the pause in the court like a place where voices gathered but did not fall into song. She thought of all the small things that kept a person known to themselves, a favorite robe, the taste of a childhood fruit, the thumbprint in a bowl. She thought, too, of her grandmother's hands, crusted with salt and blue, teaching her to grind pigment with rice until the mixture was soft enough to sing. Her fingers closed around the scrap. "Thank you," she said. It was the smallest of words, and Rong nodded as if that were enough. When he left, the room felt colder and fuller. Mei Lin placed the scrap next to her journal and opened a fresh page. She did not write a recipe. Instead, she wrote a single line in her neat, small hand, found a southern blue thin thread of recipe. Smell of salt. Emperor's memory weakest at dawn. She could easily have wrapped the cloth in paper and delivered it to the imperial stores. That would have been safe. It would have removed the temptation and the risk. But the thing that moved in her was not merely curiosity. It was lineage. The women in her family had kept their recipes in songs and hymns for generations because the world did not trust their value. When the state had insisted that trade be reduced, it had not accounted for the work done by women in kitchens and kilns whose craft did not fit the public ledger. Mei Lin had, as a child, learned that craft could be the only anchor to a person. She had seen how a faded stitch on a sleeve could summon a father's name. She steeled herself in the only way an artisan knows how. She prepared to test. She set out the smallest of tools, a cleaned mortar, a pinch of pure rice, a bowl of warm water. Her hands moved slowly and deliberately, as if each motion could be a prayer. The scrap lay on the table, the blue a small constellated wound in the dusk. "If this is real," she murmured, though she knew she was mostly speaking to the ghosts of her grandmother and to the slow gods of making. "If this will remember, it must be used with care." Outside, the palace emptied into the soft, secret hour when corridors exhaled and servants drifted home. The lamps were banked in the inner hall, and the gardens whispered of koi and of stone. A fox cry lifted from somewhere beyond the walls, thin and sharp. In the quiet, Mei Lin's breath seemed too loud. She worked by lamplight. She did not mean at first to test the pigment against paper. What she wanted was to feel the mineral's behavior. She scraped a minuscule shaving from the blue so small it seemed sacrilegious to waste it, and she mixed it with a touch of rice water. The powder did not dissolve instantly. It resisted like a thing reluctant to consent to explanation. When it finally gave, it did so with a depth that surprised her, a liquid that slid across the surface of her bowl like a night tide. It caught the lamp and held it in a way that no northern manufacture could. For a moment Mei Lin's eyes watered not from fumes, but from the sheer recognition of something made whole again. She dabbed a single stroke on a scrap of paper. The mark soaked in like a memory returning to a face. It was blue, but it was not merely color, it was a voice, a small call across the years. Mei Lin felt absurdly, as if she had placed her thumb against a man's wrist and felt a pulse. The room tilted with possibility and with terror. If color reached into memory, what would it mean if the emperor remembered in full? Would the past return like a tide, bringing with it debts and grudges and the raw edges of the purge that had outlawed these pigments? Or would color be a bomb, an honest attempt to restore what had been stripped away by time and by policy? She folded the scrap back into the paper and slid it inside the journal. Her hands trembled, not because she feared the act of concealment, but because she understood with a clarity that came not from intellect, but from the old, practiced intimacy of craft, that this single found thing could tip her life. She had already begun cataloguing what might be lost, a name, a favorite bird, the line of a poem. Now there was a path dangerous, narrow, and glittering that might lead to recovery. She did not know yet whether the path led to a bright shore or to a cliff. At the chamber threshold, a maid's footfall paused. Court maid, you had come, perhaps to ask after a commission, perhaps to deliver gossip. Mei Lin closed the journal. You should leave before the palace lamps go out, she said, keeping her voice level. Your eyes lingered on the scrap as Mei Lin's hands folded it away. Her face tightened with a fear Mei Lin recognized in younger people, fear wrapped in loyalty. I bring word, you whispered. They speak in the outer court. They say Mei Lin cut her a look. Not now. We talk later. After the maid left, Mei Lin smoothed the page closed and set the journal under her pillow. She lay awake that night thinking of blues that had once colored the world as naturally as breath sky blues and sea blues and the stone blues of a child's favorite bead. The palace slept in grey. Somewhere, a man who had been taught to speak in the voice of the empire might be learning, piece by piece, how to be himself again if only someone could remind him. She did not know whether to be the person who reminded him. But the scrap lay under her pillow like a small, illicit sun. She could not bring herself to burn it. Outside, the dim lattice of the city sighed, and the ocean beyond the capital breathed steady and cold. Mei Lin turned over and closed her eyes, a cultivator of pigments and of memory, and for the first time since the banners had paled, she felt a lightness that bordered on hope. At the edge of sleep, she imagined the emperor's lashes fluttering open at the sight of a proper cobalt sky painted across a screen. She imagined him naming a child's name without confusion. She imagined dangerous, intoxicating that color might not only touch the mind but call it home. A single footstep sounded in the corridor and died away. In the small house of her chest there was a stirring, the faint hum of a song her grandmother had taught when salt air had blurred the horizon. She folded that song into her bones as if preparing a recipe. Dawn would come. She would rise and go about her work, as always. But now, in the grey court, a small point of impossible blue had been resurrected, and nothing in Mei Lin's craft had ever taught her to ignore such discoveries. Outside, the palace light had the look of something holding its breath. Inside, under the lamp, a blue mark faintly stained a paper scrap, and the journal under Mei Lin's pillow knew the weight of a secret. The world, even as it faded, contained still the possibility of color. The question was what she would do with it. The palace woke in muted steps and muted voices. Mei Lin woke with a decision half formed in the soft part of her mind. She did not yet commit herself to the expedition that would follow, or to the web of danger that new color would weave. She only knew that she had a scrap, a line in a journal, and the memory of a blue that had the private urgency of a call for return. For the first time in many seasons, she felt the old, reckless impulse of her grandmother's hands stirring in her own, to keep what beauty could not keep itself. The grey court breathed around her like a thing on the verge of losing another layer. Mei Lin told herself she was only an artisan, but the craft she kept might, if she chose it, become the quietest kind of rebellion. Mei Lin learned first to listen with her hands. As a child she had sat on a low stool beside her grandmother, watching the rhythm of stone on stone and learning to hear the difference between grit and grit that would bloom. The old woman would grind a pebble under the arc of a palm and then tap the flat side of a porcelain dish so the sound could be judged. A clear, bell-like note meant purity, a dull croak, contamination. It was a music of textures, a grammar of mineral and flesh that a decade in the capital could never wholly erase. Those lessons lived beneath Mei Lin's fingernails. They were the private map she consulted in the night when court life softened into shadow and the palace's pallor felt like a wound she could not name. She woke the morning after the eunuch's furtive visit with a weight of memory and of work. At the studio the light was thin, and her brushes lay like small sleeping birds. The court moved through its rituals in a hush. Banners passed mute along corridors, lacquer seemed to drink the light instead of reflecting it, and servants wrapped objects as if shielding them from grief. Mei Lin's own palette, once a careful spectrum of warmed jasper and sunlit saffron, sat muted mostly washes of neutralized tea, pewter greys, a residual iron brown she could never quite coax into anything joyous. But she had the fragment. The piece of southern silk had been folded into her sleeve like a fossil, a thread of outlawed writing, a smear of a color that did not belong to any book in the imperial library. In the night, when the palace stole its breath, she had traced the strange mineral name with a fingertip. The characters felt wrong, curved in a dialect her tutors never taught, but the smear of blue beside it was a sort of proof. A stain of a sky she remembered from the coast, the color of fish scales after a storm. She kept the fragment in a little cedar box with a lock that did nothing but keep the box private. Grandmother's hands came to her then in the small rituals of the studio. Mei Lin set a shallow porcelain teacup on her work table, the bowl that had accompanied her through the precarious early years at court. It was thin and almost weightless, rimmed with the faint line of repair from some long-ago fracture, and she liked the way it drank ink and left a trace of its hunger. She put a kettle on to boil and placed the cedar box beside the cup. The fragment slid from the silk like a sliver of memory, and she breathed as if summoning a ghost. The old woman's voice arrived in her mouth at first as tune and then as instruction. Rice first, grandmother would sing, voice low like the head of a bell, so the grit will learn to float. She set a few spoonfuls of polished rice into a small mortar and crushed it with a pestle until the grains gave off a wet, starky smell, warm as bread, plain as home. Then she opened the little jar where she had carried the minute pinch she had managed to borrow 2 nights earlier from the market. A sample crushed so fine it looked like dust from blue seas. In memory, the shore was never far away. She could smell the salt in her grandmother's sleeve, the fish-burn tang of smoked nets. They had worked at a low table lined with bowls. The old women would sing songs that hid instructions. When the tide licks the pebble, add a drop of lime. When the gull cries twice, fold in the husk. The songs named no states, no officials, only weather and appetite and kin. The recipes were stored not in books but in songs and the shape of a hand. When the northern soldiers came through after the southern courts were broken, they burned the records and left the women to carry what they could in melody and memory. Mei Lin had always thought of those songs as private currency and inheritance handed over lips, not ledgers. They meant the difference between making something that would last and making something that would slough off with the next rain. She mixed the crushed rice into the teacup with warm water, stirring until a faint opacity swam at the surface. Then, with thumb and fingertip, she pinched the blue dust and set it into the rice slurry. It sank in like a guilty animal, an instant of dark in white. She covered the cup with a scrap of silk and set it aside beneath the eaves of her studio window where the courtyard wind came cool and dry. The old rules wrapped the experiment: patience, watched breath and silence. To hurry was to invite spoilage. To brag was to invite theft. The waiting felt like prayer. Mei Lin paced the studio, hands clasped behind her back. Outside, a cart's wheel scraped the flagstones. Someone laughed in the corridor and then fell quiet, aware of the palace's collective murmuring. The teacup sat like a little sealed world. When at last she lifted the cloth, she found only a faint sediment in the rice water, the blue dim but determined as a thought of home. She dabbed a bit on the tip of a scrap of paper and let it dry. It faded, but the dried edge kept a halo of color that had weight. Even that thin edge made something in her loosen. She felt the old hunger, the need to see color arrive like a friend. She moved cautiously. On a hidden shelf she kept a handful of minor commissions, a porcelain teacup for an attendant, a small commemorative scroll for a household ritual, a scholar's fan that would never leave a study. She selected the teacup with the hairline repair and set it before her. With a sable brush the width of a fine root, she lifted a touch of the fermented pigment and brushed the rim. The stroke was a promise more than a painting, a thin, trembling band like a smile. The color seized the glaze like a memory finding a face. When the teacup dried, something in the white of the porcelain seemed altered, not only in hue but in intention. The blue sat as if it had been there forever, a layer of recollection that the white knew how to receive. Mei Lin cupped the object in both hands and felt it respond. The rim was cool and small against her palm, and the line of blue felt like a note waiting to be sung. She might have kept it to herself. She might have let the color live as a private salvage and refine it in secret until it could withstand scrutiny. But palace life is a small, breathing thing. Secrets refuse to be solitary. That afternoon, when the attendant in charge of the imperial tea came into the painting rooms to retrieve a piece of ceremonial silk, Mei Lin had her hands full with another commission and asked the maid to set the teacup on a tray for later cleaning. The maid, Jiao, soft-voiced and quick-eyed, took it between her palms and carried it through the low door into the corridors where devotion and gossip traveled with equal speed. It was a small mercy that the maid paused. At the end of her path was a corridor where the emperor's private attendants folded robes and arranged fresh flowers. Yao set the teacup down on a low shelf to tie a knot on a ribbon. The blue caught the corner of a silk sleeve, glinted, and then seemed to speak. Yao blinked, touched the rim with a tentative finger, and swallowed. She whispered a word she had not said in years. Blue. The word moved like a ripple. A junior clerk passing by stopped, peered, and then leaned close to examine the teacup, his face rearranged. For a moment it was as if a window had been opened in his expression. Then a palace maid pushed through the far door, carrying a tray for the emperor's afternoon refreshment. Her foot clicked on the stone like a metronome. She saw the teacup and paused, the same small light passing over her face. When I was a child, she said without thinking, he used to ask for a cup painted like the sky. He would hold it like the sea. By the time the emperor's petty rituals were done and the attendants returned to their tasks, a rumor had begun. That night, in the folded dark between the palace roofs, the rumor glided down service stairs and into small rooms where women mended lace and men rubbed tired hands. A cup, they whispered, painted blue. Someone at the studio. Mei Lin heard the gossip like a distant bell. She did not run from it. She did not acclaim herself. Instead, she poured the leftover pigment into a vial and sealed it with wax. She wrapped the teacup in silk and set it in her cedar box again. The little band of blue felt private and dangerous all at once. It tasted of possibility and of consequence. Night after night, she returned to the memory of grinding at the beach. Grandmother's knees had been freckled and thick with the marks of years. Her palms smelled of cured fish and lime and the resin of old boats. The recipe had been a litany: pulverize, wash, ferment with rice, wash again, bake in sun, not a single step trivial or without meaning. The women of the southern ateliers had learned to extract color not by force but by patience. They coaxed it from stone as one might coax a secret from a child. If the blue touched memory, Mei Lin thought, perhaps it was because the process involved time, a slow repetition that allowed pigment and object to recognize one another. The blue that bloomed on the teacup's rim did not merely sit on the surface. It seemed to anchor something invisible, a phrase of a poem, a child's laugh, the way a monarch once leaned on a windowsill to watch gulls. She remembered how, years ago, she had painted a scroll of washed leaves, and how a scholar had named the exact tree that lived in his childhood courtyard. Color, when true, did not lie. It remembered on behalf of its viewers. That night she dreamt of the coast. A child ran the length of a beach, its skirt a wet smear of salt and kelp, and called for a woman with palms like weathered brick. The woman lifted a stone, and the child saw a mote of sky. When she woke, the air in the studio tasted like wet sand. She also felt fear. Forbidden things in the palace had a way of creating maps on people's tongues. A small miracle would be swallowed by the Grand Secretary's machine if it could be traced to an origin. The laws that had extinguished certain dyes had been political as much as practical. Colors associated with a fallen kingdom had been declared dangerous, symbols that might stir provincial loyalties, memories that might lead to mourning and, ultimately, to action. Mei Lin knew those papers existed in the imperial archives, edicts written with the mechanical cold of men who had been raised to mistrust the body's urges for sensation. Yet to do nothing felt worse. She had seen the emperor in court 2 nights before, eyes like pale river stones that sometimes reflected an old radiance. A color might be small, but if it could reanimate a moment of self-recognition in him, it could be a hinge. She thought of consorting